ready for the main speaker of today, and with all due respect to the former speakers, the main reason why I got this event in the first place is basically that Jim said, look, I'm coming to Holland. Any chance of getting together? I said, yeah. And this idea formed in my mind. And for me personally, these three gentlemen have been very important for forming my thoughts about these subjects. So I took the opportunity to put them together, and I'm very happy to inspire. So without further ado, I'll give you James R from Montreal, Canada.
Well, first, on the part of my co-author and partner in life, Elizabeth Van Every, we're both extremely delighted to be back. It's now 9 years, far too long to be away. And as Jan has said, we came here initially, I think, in '97 on invitation to speak to the group, the LAP group. And we kept in touch with LAP practically until it collapsed, you might say. And so this has been very rich for us. We've spent time here. We've taught at Tilburg. We've taught at Amsterdam. And it's been just a wonderful thing, and it's great to be back. I should begin, however, though, by explaining something. Whereas, as Erik said, it's important to add to technical, social. In other words, social technical is not just technical, but you add the social. We're actually in the opposite boat. We're all social and no tech. And we have to, my field is organizational communication. It's a field that is developed out of communication studies, but not communication studies in the usual way of media. Because one of the things that occurred in the United States, uniquely in the United States, there were two fields of communication studies. One of them was media-oriented. The other was speech-oriented, curiously enough. And it's the speech-oriented version of communication that started first. In fact, it goes back to the beginning of the 20th century. So my own area, my own training was with I don't know if the name Ross Ashby has any meaning to you whatsoever, but it was, my thesis advisor was his student. And so I've been interested for a long time in the notion of the interacting parts as a basis of communication. The other side, you know, because we talk about enterprise engineering, well, I'm all enterprise and no engineering. So I warn you of this because you will see when you see my slides, they're not an engineer's slides at all. They're a rather awkward student of organization. And Elizabeth and I continue to work. I've been retired, but we continue to work and doing research, and our research really consists of going into an organization and spending time and talking to people and listening to people, collecting as much as we can of the data that the organizations throw up, and trying to make sense of what it is that we discover. In other words, contrary to really starting from first principles, we work the opposite way. That we start from observations and what's happening. What's going on? And why do people do what they do? And why do the curious things happen that seem to be always happening in organization? We intersect very strongly with LAP. And we've had, Jan and we've had great discussions about that. In fact, you could say that our work, I'm going to call it communicative action theory. I made that up, by the way. It's not really communicative action theory. I just made that up because I had to have a title for here. But it is based, it builds on that earlier work. In fact, you could say, this is a bad joke, the cat is on the lap. So let me go on from there. we start not from interpersonal, and here I think where Jan and I think we have talked about this before, and we'll hopefully, before the night is over, talk about it again. I think tendency lab as interpersonal. I think Jan would argue otherwise, but to my view, it's interpersonal. And if you looked at the dolls he had, you found you and me, and that's interpersonal. And I'm going to argue for another perspective on communication from that. Where we are now is because Elizabeth and I are working on a book. Hopefully, it's based on 2 very extensive case studies that we did, and I'm going to talk a little bit about, or some of the material we got. I'm going to present some of the material that we got from one of the case studies. We're starting from the assumption that organizations exist only in and through their continuing authoring. The word author is that in fact organizations must be constituted in member-centered processes of communicating as they go about doing their work. The topic, therefore, is how and with what what the consequences are. Not accidentally, the word author, I think not accidentally, is connected to the Latin word authority. It was curious to me that I started looking at a lot of literature in my own field, organizational communication, and in the management literature. And I went simply through all the indexes that I could find. I did the usual online searches by keywords. My keyword was authority. And I found practically nothing. Nobody seems to be interested in authority. And yet, to me, it's crucial. And I will argue, furthermore, that the people in organizations consider it to be crucial. So let's have a look. First question is, that has been raised here already, is what is an organization? And let's take a look at 2 definitions. I dug these up in the usual way. Go into Google. There are several dictionaries there. So I select out of those dictionaries the ones that please me, and I group them in the way that it pleased me. And this is my first set of definitions. It's the act or process of organizing or of being organized. It's the state, condition, or matter of being organized. And so you can have more organization or less. And it's a group of people who are organizing for a certain purpose. That's one way to think about organization. But it's not the only way. There's a second way. And this gets us into some difficulties. Because this one says that an organization is not a process, not an organizing, not a continuing, but it's something that has arrived. It is a whole. It is an organism. It is a structure. It is an ordered whole. Now, that no longer is about process. That's no longer about getting organized. And the worst part of that is that it's even worse. It leads to the next, it's a person. That an organization is actually a person. You say, no, that can't be. Yes, it can be. And the law treats the organization as a person. If you read the daily papers in the business pages, you'll read that all about that, let me see, Boeing considers that Microsoft has decided that Apple would like Now, these are all emotions that people have. And furthermore, we treat organizations as a center of intention and purpose. Now, that is no doubt to me that when you, that the issue about that we address is, well, how did it get to be a person? By the way, the idea that the organization is a person, well, I did find a reference. I found a reference for that, a clear one, and it's a very well-written one, and I would recommend it to anybody. It was published in 1651, and it's written by a man called Thomas Hobbes, who was an English social philosopher, and he wrote a book called The Leviathan. And if you want to know how and why an organization is a person, read The Leviathan. It's all very clearly spelled out. So an organization is two different conceptions, and like a lot of words that we use them carelessly. And so when we talk about an organization, we throw the word around. Everybody says, yeah, I know what an organization is. Sure. Everybody knows what an organization is. There's no doubt about that, except that we mean two different things. And people, this is a very normal process in human communication. We use words fluidly with more than one meaning because everybody's used to having them used with more than one meaning. And there's no trouble decoding them. Until, of course, if you're an engineer, you would like to pin them down. And that point gets harder. Now, how did it get to be a person? And that is where I would take issue with Jan. When he had his, what would you call them, what, dolls? Or when they were figures talking to each other, you notice something? First person and second person. First person, second person. Second person, back to first person. What happened? If my knowledge of Dutch is very thin, my knowledge of English is good enough. And I can tell you there are three, when you look at pronouns in English, and I guarantee in Dutch, there are three persons. There's first person, there's second person, and there's third person. How did that third person get in there? Where did the third person come from? What's it doing in a conversation when there are just two people, you, well, I mean, your collective, the you, I am to me, I, and you are to me, you. Where's the third person? Not here, is it? Or is it? Or is it? Maybe the third person is here. And it's the issue of the third person that has preoccupied us. So, to summarize that, organization is absent physically, other than it is extensions through you, me, buildings, technology, all those other things, but those are not the organization as person, they are in its extensions through its agents. Organization is the third person in a two-person conversation. Elizabeth and I have been studying, well, it's now some time ago, it was 10 years ago we started work on this. We were in New Zealand. And in New Zealand, at the time, it was an interesting time in New Zealand because in 1985, there was a socialist government elected. It actually was in '84 it was elected. And they came in and discovered that the New Zealand budget was in really bad shape. There was a deficit. We wouldn't know about that kind of thing, would we? And they, to absolutely everybody's astonishment, a Labour government decided they had to do more through the private sector. And so they set they established a new model, and it was called the New Zealand model, in which they said, we will very much favor public-private partnerships. The police force of New Zealand at that time had a computer that they put in 1975. I believe it was a Burroughs, but I could be wrong about that. I'm not. It was a good. It was a fine computer. It was, you know, a state-of-the-art computer at the time. But 1975 was some time ago, and by the end of the 80s, it was useless for the purposes of operational policing. It really wasn't worth much. So they decided that they needed to upgrade their information and telecommunications capacity. And naturally, in the spirit of the time, they turned to the private sector for help. And in 1991, I believe it was, they hired consultants from a very large, I won't mention it, but it's a very large international firm. And they asked them to draw up a list of specifications. They did so. There were a couple of people. They stayed with the international firm, and then they broke off and started their own firm. But they continued. They were an interesting pair. One of them in particular was a red-hot techie. He was described to us as the kind of person who never went out in the daytime and had every function in his house connected to every other function, so that if you turned on this switch, everything else there was a whole sort of orchestrated movement going through the house. He was a real techie. And what he said was, we want the state-of-the-art technology, we want the bleeding edge, not just leading edge, but bleeding edge technology. We want to get into object-oriented programming. This is 1990, which object-oriented programming was still being developed. And so there were many different things that he proposed. He said, turn to the private sector, and the only company that was really capable of addressing it in New Zealand was IBM. And IBM was going through its own turbulence. If any of you remember the early 1990s, because of Microsoft and other things, IBM was having its own difficulties. And so this looked pretty attractive. It turned out to be about a $100 million project. So it's not a small project. In fact, it was one of their large ones at the time. So they made a proposal. But you can imagine, if you're IBM New Zealand, you don't have all the backup in terms of software development, technology development, engineering, you name it, they don't have it. What basically the office in New Zealand is a group of people who have become very good and very expert at implementing the usual systems, the systems that were already well in existence. And the police said, we don't want that. We want a top-notch, state-of-the-art, world-beating technology because, and said the police, not only are we going to implement it in our own force, we're going to sell it. We're going to sell it internationally, and we'll recover our costs because, as it turns out, worldwide, and they checked this, worldwide, policing had no decent technology. It was, and police work, believe you me,
Still doesn't.
and believe you me, policing work should have good technology because their essence is handling information. And furthermore, telecommunications are absolutely crucial to them. So the government put up the dough. And in 1994, they signed a contract. Notice, as we go here, that IBM and police are both persons. And that's how they can sign a contract. They, in fact, that's what they did. They signed a contract. So, as I said, the third person is the organization, a legal person, but it's also a locus of interpretations and intentions. And further, and why? Because if you are working for an organization, you have the authority it gives you. And so if you don't create the organization as an authority, you don't have any authority. So you have to do that. But creating an organization with authority is not so easy. And it's not clear that establishing the authority of an organization is a design problem. There's no doubt whatsoever in our mind, if you look at the organization as a set of organizing processes, if you look at it as a set of processes, communities of practice with their different kinds of expertise, and all linked together through various kinds of complementary links that you think of a hospital, the hospital needs the test center needs, it's all interconnected. And all that is subject to the kind of logic that is really part of engineering. There's no doubt about that. But this one, how you establish the authority of an organization, I'm not so sure that it lends itself easily to engineering. So as I say, one of the things Elizabeth and I do, is we go in and we listen. We record interviews, we look at the documentation, we talk to people, we try to get them to give us their impressions. And one of the things we discovered, as I said, there's no literature on authority, but one of the things we discover is that people are really preoccupied by authority. And here's some of the ways in which we heard about it. These are just random quotes that we pulled out for the purposes of this afternoon. We just went through with a search and used the keyword authority, and out we come with some of these. So on. There are lines of authority. A lot of talking about lines of authority. Interesting question, what's a line of authority? And finally, there was one person who said, and this one is something that stuck in my mind and has stuck in my mind ever since. Organizations fall back on authority rather than management. And I think that Jan was talking just before, as if they didn't fall back on authority, that in fact they managed. And as Erik said earlier, sometimes that's not so self-evident, that there are interest groups in an organization and they don't always see it through the rational lens. Why? Here's why. If you want to establish your authority, what you do is you evoke the organization in support of your place. Now, supposing that there are two different kinds of, let's say, inside police, there's one group that has to do with criminal investigations and another that has to do with immigration. They each have their set of interests. If a decision has to be made that involves the allocation of resources, either to CIB or to immigration, and that they both can't have the resources. And there's a chapter in our book, I think, 6 in our book, which really deals with this. If they both can't have it, they've got a problem of authority. That is to say, they've got to establish that they are entitled to it, and therefore they have the authority. And the way they do this is each one of them will call up the organization in support of them. Again, these are not new ideas, they're really old ideas. And this particular one that I'm talking about comes from a man called Georg Simmel. And Simmel was a German sociologist at the end of the 19th and early 20th century. And he described the three of them. What he said was, if you look at society, the three-part organization is absolutely crucial. It doesn't matter going to 4 or 5 or 10. That doesn't change anything. What the real shift of perspective is when you go from 2 to 3. that that if there are only two, we're in the domain of talking to each other and of negotiating and of exchanging information, of perhaps arguing, but also always within the context of you've got to make your own point based on what you know and what you understand. The minute you call up a third, you say, look, I'd love to do what you said, but the organization doesn't let me do that. If you go into any store or post office or go through the airport and you try something, you're going to find somebody who says, no, I can't do that because it's not in the rules. And that's calling up the third. And calling up the third is a way in which you establish your authority. But everybody can't have authority. There has to be, I said a few minutes ago, a line of authority. And lines of authority lead you into a very different kind of game. So, people have ideas about authority, we discovered. Authority is something that's located, so it's not everywhere. It can be given, but it can be taken away. It has a source. It always has a source. You don't have the authority. You only get the authority because there is a source that gave it to you. Even the organization has to have a source. The authority of the organization has to come from the fact that it has a source. The investors, whoever. You can assume authority, providing nobody objects. You can authorize somebody to do something. In other words, you can not only, it has a source, but you can also transmit it. It acts in and by communication. It's negotiable. It implies responsibilities. That's clear enough. If you have authority, it's because you're doing something. It's justified by its authority, but by what it's also, this now gets you into what can you author. For example, if you name somebody head of planning in the department, you have just authorized them to write the plan. It can be challenged. And to say which if it can be challenged, it means that it can also be judged. And if there is a final authority, there must be intermediate authorities. It's authority that makes what somebody says authoritative. In other words, it makes words credible if the source has the authority. And there, in this case, it's the words that act, not the person, or at least perhaps they both act. It outlaws certain behaviors. They're not authorized. But that includes people at the top as well as the bottom. To summarize, therefore, two models of organization. One is emergent, bottom-up, organizing, a coordination of the activities of specialized communities of practice, and, as far as I'm concerned, a natural target for intelligent system design. It's the kind of thing that it lends itself precisely to logic, to the development of a better way of doing things. I have absolutely no problem with that. But the other one is trickier, because what it leads to is games. When we talk about three-person, when Simmel talks about the three-person structure, what he's talking about is a three-person game. If you know von Morgenstern's notion of games, then you know that three-person games have an interesting characteristic. They have no mathematical solution. That is to say, there's a cluster of sort of best, maybe, but there is no exact mathematical solution to a three-person game. And organization involves a lot of three-person games. So it's something to be negotiated. It's something that confers legitimacy when it is. We're talking about this project, and I'm not going to talk about the whole project, but I'm going to be discussing, and I invite Elizabeth to contribute when she can, because I'm going to look at the design team itself. That is to say, in this project, what happened was they wrote the contract in '94 on the basis of these specifications, but then they had Then they had to deliver. And this became very complicated because they had to put, first, the police had done absolutely nothing. They had no staff hired. They had no buildings. They had nothing. They had done no advanced work. IBM did have. It had quarters and it had people there, but it had its own problems because it had to import all of its real expertise from stateside, from the US. And that led all kinds of complications in terms of, did they know whether these people were qualified? And at one point, they were, depending on people, they decided that we're not all that, well, you know, software engineering sometimes is what would you call it's a free show. I mean, there are lots of freelance software developers. And some of it's good and some of it's bad. You know, you hire a software developer, you may be taking your chances. I'm sure it's better. I'm sure it's not like that anymore now. But at the time, let's put it this way, at that time. The project lasted for 5 years. And our research started in 2001, well, really intensively in 2002, and we finished in 2004. We went home with interviews. We went home with, we were given the internal paperwork of the whole project. We had all the records of meetings. We had emails that people had sent to each other. We had meetings that were marked private and confidential. We had the package. Plus, there had been a couple of public studies as well. We had that. We had a terrific amount of stuff that we had plowed through. It's taken us quite a while. So in they come. They put together now an IBM team with police. What they constituted the INSYS team. How am I doing?
Fine. 20 minutes plus.
20 more?
20 plus, yeah.
20, well, I think 20 will do it. They put them all together, okay? And they come and they start to work together. So what happens? Well, we talked to an IBM designer. Now, these are people reflecting back on their experience of working with the, if you want to put it in IBM terms, working with the users. But the users did not see themselves as users. They saw themselves as the police. It's quite a difference, you know. They did not see themselves as users. They said, we're police. We're the client, not the user. We're the client. You are working for us because we pay you for this work. So this is how one IBM designer saw it. And I'll let you read it because it's pretty straightforward. And it's true, by the words at the end, I don't trust these guys. Police don't trust easily. This is one of the things we learn. And for good reason. I mean, you know, they deal with criminals all the time. So their instinctive reaction is, what's up? Here's more of the IBM. Oh, this is the, sorry, that was a designer. And this is more of it. Not a really good situation. And you didn't really have a good cohesive group on the part of IBM either. Youngish, talented, really, really skilled and capable, but they hadn't really formed as a unified team. Here comes the police. This is now a police perspective. And we had a lovely evening with two men, and I have to, Elizabeth will say, but I must confess there was a little bit of beer involved. And that was another thing we realized, working with police, a glass of beer didn't do any harm, let's put it that way. And we learned a lot. This conversation went on for about 3 hours altogether. And it's recorded and so on. So it was sort of a bit in awe, he said, at the beginning. They came over from police, and they were getting international business analysts and so on. And so you're going to lead us, yeah, okay. And then they say, it took us about a month. And these guys are incompetent. They don't know what they're doing. They can't solve our problems. So this particular guy soon lost his awe when he saw them up close. He said, this guy used to like to come in and work at 11 and sort of swan around and then do all his work and so on and so on. And this didn't suit us very well. Because he said, we like to come in at 7:30, everybody lines up, etc., have a meeting, do a debrief, do it, get it right. Come on, this is how it's done. Don't fool around, you dippy sort of software designers. Okay, then. So at the end they say, I know you don't like it, but this is what you're going to do. So, as he said, there was a major culture clash. The IBM project director, and she was absolutely marvelous. She came in, she wasn't the lead designer at the beginning. She was the lead on the project, but not the lead designer. But when she came in, she was terrific. As they put it to her, as the people we talked to put it, and these were from IBM side, she's hard as nails. But when she trusts you, she's like your grandmother. And so she was wonderful. So she said, I don't think we did understand police business. What was the problem, I said? Team of people came in. We've done it all before. We know how to do this. And they didn't. And then they encountered use cases. I haven't put this one up, but she described a crime scene in which there had been a murder. And they brought in, what did she call them? Cherry pickers, things so that they could scan the ground, collect evidence without anybody stepping on it. And they got a track, they got a boot track. And lo and behold, they caught the guy because he had the boot that fitted. It was an unusual boot, and it fitted. But of course, in come the cops with these gory pictures of the corpse. And they say, well, pass it around. And she said, I haven't included this, but she said, they were trying to get to us, and we all, from IBM, they looked at it and said, it was, in other words, there were interesting games going on, and guess what they were? Authority games. It was the issue of who's establishing authority over what. Then, gradually, after they started to work together, they had what was called, they were now well into the project, a year, more than a year, but almost 2 years. Eh?
No, this one, the joint requirements planning exercises.
Okay.
So they began to work at the end of '95, and this is at early '96.
This is early
when
'96.
they first get together.
Okay.
Joint requirements.
As I told you, this is Elizabeth's chapter. She's written this one. So they sat down and they started to work it through. And they looked at what the consultants had originally described as the needs of police, and they discovered, forget it. That what had been written as by these consultants, the technical consultants, corresponded to really good technology. It did not correspond to how the technology fit police work. And now they had to sit down and say, well, what do police do? And this is police. They said, the police themselves said, we didn't know what we did. We, too, had to work through to understand what it is that we do, because now what they're seeing it no longer in terms of their usual terms, they're now seeing their own work through the eyes of designers. And what you're getting is a feedback that makes it much richer. So they said, oh, that's what we do. And so both sides had to now begin to grasp the perspective of the other. And this is very much, this comes close to the description of your dolls. Because originally, as the police said, they didn't have IBM didn't have a clue. But at the end of it, he said that we really need to do a whole lot of analysis, and they did it, and they did it together. And they actually started to build the thing, as they said. And that's what turned out to be the catalyst. And the police remembers, we got to the stage where he said, you know, oh yeah, but I'm sorry, I think I should have put this one in earlier, because this comes back to what I wanted here was, what they did was they set up a team, a managing team, and that took over the business requirements, and so they worked together in that way. So, as they said, they paired the police officers and the business analysts, and they brought in focus groups. They brought in people from the field to check with them, did a lot of focus groups, and so on, and they worked it through. On the other hand, well, I'm so sure of the order of these is the way it should be, but they still looked at the guys who came in as nutters. You know, you look through two eyes when you look at this way. You look at the designers, how they're seeing the police, but you're also looking through the police eyes as how they see the designers. And this is now somebody at the end, because he said, you know, you get them into one room, no one can agree. And so it was an issue of getting them to agree. And then time took over. And I'm in this, and I'm going to take it on board, and I'm going to make the decisions, and it started to work because both sides were learning. And so, as I said, independent of rank, because in police, believe you me, rank is crucial. And so they learned, the police were now learning also to work in the designer culture, that there are certain things you have to do like a designer, which don't fit with ordinary police work. And this now is, he was what, this is the guy who started with police and then in with IBM, is that right?
No, this is a policeman talking.
Oh, this is still the policeman.
It was that the police began to put these teams together, and the designers supervised, and then more gradually,
yeah,
the whole thing moved to design,
yeah,
to design, and police were there as, a few police were
yeah,
there as advisors in lesser role.
yeah. Okay, and then, well, I'll go through the rest of these. And then they began to recognize, and now the police began to recognize how brilliant these guys they were working with were. That they could do things that police did not understand at the beginning, what they saw at the beginning were nutters. Now what they see are very talented and brilliant people doing extraordinary work. And this is now somebody who did start with police. He's a software designer. He started as working for police, but as he said, it was just an income stream, because then he moved to IBM. And when we talked to him, he was working for IBM in the office there. So he said, you know, then there were friendships began to develop. Then there was a real sense in which they were working together. So, our conclusions. How am I doing? Just about made it. Authoring of organization takes place at every level, and not merely at the top level of top management. It's both a premise and a product of object-oriented activity. Authoring is directed to an object, but the conversation also establishes the relative authority of those who are involved, because precedence is always involved. There's something. I started life, by the way, not as a producer, a radio and television producer, which I spent some time doing, 10 years, nor as a professor, but as a farmer. I did 4 years of honest-to-God work. Then I decided that was no future. But one of the things I learned working with animals, there is precedence everywhere. And one of the things I've observed over the years, nowhere more than in a university, where every minute difference of status is calculated. Which articles are out, how many, what journal, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Precedence is important. And if you're going to work together, if you're going to do creative work, and this is what it seems to us came out of the IBM, the IBM police experience. If you're going to do creative work, you have to solve also the authority issue. Successful design, therefore, is conditional on establishing an authority relationship. And this one, resistance to change, although it may be embodied in people, because there's often accusation that, oh, those people are resistant to change, as if it was the individuals who were resisting. But those individuals are tied in to a line of authority. They are themselves constrained by their organization. They're not free spirits. And if they resist, it's because their organization resists. So what happened to INSIS? Sadly enough, what Erik referred to at one point in his talk happened. There were differences of interest at head office. I'm not going to describe it. You'll have to buy our book when it comes out. It wasn't pretty. But I'll briefly just say, they hired one of their own to head up the INSIS project. He turned out to be first class. He was a young and fast-rising officer. He'd made a very good record in police. He'd won a scholarship to study at Harvard. He did public administration at Harvard. He came back. Everybody said, this guy's on a fast track to being commissioner. And so they made him head of INSIS. And then police, I think, you don't know, you can't look inside heads. But what we think is that police automatically are suspicious. And so they said to themselves, you know, this guy, he doesn't have the years of experience for dealing with a tough company like IBM. If he'd only known that IBM was as in much trouble as police were. But IBM, you know, it's a big monster. No. So they went to Australia from New Zealand, and they hired somebody who did have some experience, mainly experience in mid-level management of a large technology project. They brought him in. And what was the consequence? They then said, well, now the head of INSIS won't report to the police chief running the project. He will report to the director of INT. And the director of INT had every motive in the world to prevent INSIS from being a success, because he gets no credit for it if INSIS is a success, and instead to build up his own empire in INT, which is precisely what he did. And furthermore, then police at the same time set up a BPR, a business process re-engineering project, simultaneous with their new project. And so there was, now you've got another interest group forming in head office. We are doing BPR. You can't move ahead on system development because we haven't decided on the future design of police. And then they set up another committee, which was called Policing 2000. And this was an assembly of senior officers who would sit there together and look down the road and say, you know, where's policing going? And we'll have to think about the challenges of police. And in the process, what happened to INSIS? As I say, read our book.
We can, I guess we can guess, Jim. Yeah. Thank you very much. Well, there's a small pattern, just say that for 1 minute.
Okay.
There's a small pattern emerging here, which is that though obviously you've talked a lot about matters acutely related to emergence, you haven't mentioned it much. So I'm going to do the same as I did with Jan, also just to sum it up nicely. Would you be able to summarize briefly where emergence is in all this? I mean, it's obvious it's there, but could you give a summary of that and just point towards that term?
Well, you see, my problem is not finding emergence, it's finding anything else. It's the stability that is hard for me to come by. I got, you know, because my background, as I said, is in organization studies, not anything else. But as it turns out, you know, 1975 was an interesting year because it was the first year that there was a personal computer put on the market, and it was put on in what was it called? It was an assemble it your own machine, by 1976, 77, they were starting to offer different products. And 1975 was another year. It was the first year that digital switches were introduced, and it was by a Canadian firm at the time, Northern Telecom, which then became Nortel, and has then sadly collapsed afterwards. But at the time, it was a highly innovative company, and it introduced the first digital switch. So it's 1975. We did the very first on-site examination of what online messaging will do to an organization. This was a small group in Montreal of about 20 people, and they went online. So, and two of my students did the research, and what we built it on was an analysis of the accumulated software. Of the accumulated messaging, the messages. We had a record of all the messages that were sent and so on. And what we discovered was that an organization which had been pretty vertical began gradually to dissolve, and it began to spread. A lot more people became involved, but also the level of hierarchy began to change. It flattened. And as a result of that, I became terribly interested in the effect of new technologies on organizational process and structure. Emergence.
Well, let's say emergence as opposed to blueprint design is also a nice one, right?
Yes. Well, I would cite our example that it was emergent. You know, once that the clients, namely the police and the system designers, got together, it was highly emergent. In other words, they did develop a first-class system. And it's still being used, by the way. It's still the basis of the operations of police in New Zealand.
Okay, I'll let you off the hook for now, but not entirely, because I do want to give you an opportunity to ask questions. Yes.
In fact, I have two questions. I'll use the microphone. I have, in fact, two questions. The first one is of highly philosophical nature. The name of Martin Buber.
Who?
Martin Buber, a philosopher of the post-war years.
Oh, Buber. Yes. Okay. Sorry, my pronunciation. I beg your pardon.
I pronounced it
No. I'm sure you've correctly. Yes.
Well, he dwells a lot on the meaning of ich und du, I and you.
Yeah.
And the third person he calls es, or it. And it is not authoritative person in that relationship.
Yes. Oh boy, I haven't looked. I haven't looked at Buber for quite a while. What do I have to say? The third person has different. Clearly, the third person plays several functions. I'm not suggesting it has only one function. Far from it. What the third person, it's a way of situating a two-person conversation with respect to a third point. I'm not sure in the whole, what do people go out and measure land and so what are they called? Surveyors. I think surveyors use that. Don't they use, if somebody knows about surveying, I think that what they typically do, if they're measuring something, they also have a third point. Triangulation, exactly. And there's a wonderful study of the seamanship in the South Pacific, and that's exactly what they do. They use the third point as a way of orienting themselves with respect to something. I would think that the third point serves that in human communication as well. It is a way by which we can continually construct our own geography, if you want to call it that way. If we can construct our own interactive space, that I'm, you're in that place, I'm in this place, and we can decide, we can get a two-dimensional picture of this only by adding a third. I'm not sure if I'm responsive to your question, though.
Oh, you definitely are. Martin Buber goes more in the theological.
Yes. As I say, I haven't dared. I haven't had the courage to face Buber lately.
But the bearing of what he says is very much the same as what you say about authority as a third person in the relationship between you and.
That's interesting. Thank you. Thank you.
The next question.
I did an article in which I used Buber as my point of reference, but the article was turned down.
The next short question, I can be quick on that. When I was educated as an enterprise architect, my professor referred me to Morgan's metaphors, or Morgan's metaphors, as a way of looking at enterprises in a variety of metaphors, either being it an organism, or a clockwork, or a political system, or a social system.
Yes.
In total, about 20 or more equations to look at an organization and to understand what really makes that organization happen and occur, and then pick out as an architect the relevant images you derive from that, and base your design on, if you will.
Yes, that's a quite well developed field. Joop Cornelissen who's at Amsterdam Free University, has written a good deal on that. There was a book by Morgan really, which was based on metaphors of organization, and it's a very rich field. In fact, I think you're right, because what Elizabeth and I do is we confront a mass of data. And the only way you can deal with that is to try different metaphors on it, if you like that. I don't think of it that way myself, but that's what it amounts to. You try out ideas. You look to see if you can find patterns, and then in those patterns you try to decide, does that confirm? And then as you accumulate experience between several organizations, you begin to ask yourself, are we finding here a common pattern? And I think there is a common pattern in the sense that one of the issues of implementing new technologies is how you get around this barrier that the police discovered of all these interests who are competing with each other inside head office. And believe you me, it's not just police. Typical head office operations involve different services, and they all want their perks. They're all competing for the same pot of gold. And furthermore, not just the same pot of gold, but for prestige. That promotion and position becomes incredibly important. And my own belief is that there's only one way around that, and it's that it's the chief executive, him or herself. If the chief executive does not take the responsibility for breaking through that, there are huge brakes put on. But if the chief executive is clearly in favor of an innovation and prepared to go to the wall for it, it will happen. And that's it. I'm not much of an advocate of hero theory, but in that sense, it seems to me that it's crucial because the organization must authorize this new activity. Because what happens there is resistance to change in the sense that organizations are all, they're structured. They're not accidental collections of individuals. Every individual is already tied into a network, a web. And individual action is not, you just can't, if you're an individual in an organization, you just can't do anything you like. You are constrained by your relationships with your coworkers, with your superiors, with your clients, with all kinds of things. And so if you're going to move, there has to be somebody who will step forward and say the organization itself authorizes this. I talked too long, don't I?
One final question about that.
Yes, you showed us two definitions of organization. One was the processes and the change, and one was the more established side with structure, which also plays the organism on the established side. But one could argue that the processes and structure together are more like an organism. But why do you place it on the established side?
That's a good question. I don't know. I'm prepared to revise my position on that one.
Okay.
Good question. I wondered about that myself.
That's always a good note to start with. Thank you for listening. We'll have a short break, it's fine. We're running slightly late, that's not a problem, because there's only so much people can go with. So just 5 minutes, but we'll have to break. There won't be any coffee for now, but there will be drinks after the discussion. So after this, the discussion.